Hey guys, quick content warning. The next image has suicide and self-harm, and it's pretty grim, so take care when watching. If you need to look away while you're listening to the slide, go ahead and do that. Take care of yourself because you deserve it. All right, here we go. Okay, so from one dark place to another, we've talked about the practicalities of dressing femme in the Roman world. Now we're on to gender norms and behavior expectations. Some of these we've seen in play already. Think back to Livy. Roman men were thought to be at their best when they are controlling their family, but also protecting their family from outside influences. And the worst, well, not the worst, I suppose, worst nightmare is very relative, but one of the most common nightmare scenarios for ancient people, because it was a really common scenario, was the scenario in which your home is under attack. The enemy are invading. They come in, they take your family, they traffic them, and then your family has to live out the rest of their life without bodily autonomy, being forced to labor in dangerous and humiliating and soul-crushing conditions. And you are no longer able to fulfill the masculine expectations of your culture. Yeah. If you can't physically be there to protect your family, you have failed as a patriarch. Similarly, the ideal woman, and of course this is pretty class dependent, but the ideal woman is as a wife and as a mother, not as a sex worker and not as an enslaved person. And this is at the root of modern dichotomies between the Madonna whore complexes and that kind of thing. This tendency that we still have, almost this cultural tick, to classify women as either all good, wonderful mothers or sexualized objects and therefore unworthy of protection and admiration. Super toxic, yes. And we are rightly, as a culture, trying to step back from that a bit for reasons that this makes clear are fair. Yeah, because you cannot control always the circumstances under which your body is assaulted. And we're talking in the ancient world about rules of warfare that take as given, expected, and right physical assaults upon children and women. So, what we're looking at now, and why we're going to this very depressing place, is a statue that survived from classical antiquity. It was part of a war memorial in what's now modern day Turkey, ancient Ionia. And it was meant to commemorate the repelling of Gaulish invaders from Greek-speaking city-states. So this is called The Dying Gaul and His Wife. So here, the dying Gaul is nude both because that's how Mediterranean people pictured Northern Europeans, but also because of this preference in Mediterranean art for the nude male body as heroic and tragic and idealized. So he's there meeting all of the body standards that Roman men tried to live up to, and my goodness, difficult. And he's looking over his shoulder, and what he's looking at, we know from contemporary descriptions, are the coming, in this case, Greeks, but Romans loved this statue too because they imagined that it was now the Romans coming for the Gauls. So the dying Gaul looks over his shoulder, he sees the enemy coming, he has already killed his wife, which is why she's kind of flopping there at his feet, and then he is about to kill himself to avoid capture. And this was something that is working on a couple of levels for the viewers, right? So this isn't made by Gauls for Gauls to look at. This is made by Mediterranean peoples, Greeks, and Romans too, who had this copied and kept it, which is why we have copies. So Romans loved this because first they get to feel super effective because they've conquered a lot of Gauls, which, spoilers, is what Romans are about to do this century. They also have a long grudging history with the Gauls, and they view them as aggressors, as less civilized and therefore less valuable humans, and also humans that they view with this imperialist gaze of both covetousness, but covetousness in order to own and to exploit, yeah? So when they see this, they're seeing, haha, we won, you're dead, but then they're also seeing that, okay, we won, but you are an idealized enemy, right? You're an enemy worth conquering because even though you're a barbarian, you protect your family, you see your death coming, and you make the decision to spare your family from the consequences of warfare. Now, this has yet a third layer to it that's even more depressing and toxic, namely, this ideal, right? This is what you're supposed to do when you're conquered. You see the conquerors coming, and therefore you liquidate your family, then you liquidate yourself, and therefore avoid capture. If you don't do this, the logic goes, then you are tacitly consenting to be kidnapped, trafficked, and exploited. So the idea at the bottom of all of this is a victim blaming narrative that excuses and promotes the exploitation of enslaved people while simultaneously preserving this idea of Roman and Greek superiority over Northern Europe. But what's also interesting about this is that even behind all of this toxic horribleness, there's an idea here that masculinity and femininity and all of the norms encompassed in being a good man and a good woman are, in a way, independent of culture. So the final, well, blow and act of violence in art like this coming out of the Mediterranean world is that it's saying that Greco-Roman ideas about what men are and what women are and what good men are and what bad men are and what good women are and what bad women are, all of this says is not a cultural construct, rather it's a human universal constant. This is an assumption that isn't really borne out by data. Even ancient people knew that the data do not support this. Different people do things differently. But then that's not how prejudice works, is it? It doesn't stand up to logic really well because that's not what it's about. It's about making yourself feel good about you and okay about what you're doing to other people. But then this also reveals an insecurity that Mediterranean people had to live with because this ideal, A, is kind of horrifying when you look at it like this, but it's also unachievable, right? Nobody can ever live up to all of the items on the perfect man list or the perfect woman list. Like, even if we feel a gender binary really, really strongly, we're still going to fall short. And these expectations are unreasonable, right? Men cannot always protect their families. They just can't. Women can't always balance their lives as wives and mothers equally, let alone balance themselves as whole beings against the expectations of their family. These are unachievable standards, like most standards, right? I don't think any of us, if we're being really honest with ourselves, even to our best ideals, do we ever live up to those. So what I also see in here, and one way to make this a bit less depressing, is that the experience of feeling pressured to live up to an unachievable ideal isn't something that only we experience. This is something that the people of the past join us in. and it's one of the ways that we can feel a certain bond with antiquity. And looking at how these dynamics manifest in different times and in different places can help us to identify these moments where we're being unfair to ourselves and our neighbors, and perhaps choose to be kinder, to be more open in our expectations for each other, and to generally just be less douche nozzly people, or at least not kill people so much. Okay, so talking about unachievable gender norms, let's go through some of those specifically for women. And this is compiled out of tombstones, but there are also like ancient handbooks where men, because most of, actually, I'm trying to think, no, most of what was written from antiquity that survives is written by men. There were women authors, there were women scientists for that matter. Their work didn't get copied over the years, so we're left with just little bits and pieces of them. So, this is what ancient men have to say about what they're looking for in an ideal woman. Interestingly, sometimes the same women who write these tracts choose very different women to date, which I find telling and interesting. Right, so the ideal woman is modest. And what we mean by modest in a Roman context is that she's adhering to dress norms that cover specific parts of the body, but also she adheres to a certain level of mitigated contact with the outside world. So she has supervision with her when she interacts with people who are not also women. She's careful with the kinds of friends she keeps. So this is about so much more than clothing. This is also about preserving a lifestyle that is meant to offer proof of your inward commitment to fidelity and your willingness to sacrifice yourself in the interests of your family. She was also supposed to be cheerful, which, well, not much has changed. I don't have great data on uh, Romans going around in the streets ordering women to smile, but it sounds typical. So, right, cheerfulness is a big thing. And also supportiveness for the men in their lives. Roman women in particular were supposed to be very interested and invested in their male relatives' political and social careers, and to be active participants in helping to advance that. And that's where loyalty comes into. You're supposed to be most loyal to your father, next your children, then your husband, and if all goes well, then the state. Restraint is big, and this goes along with this modesty culture. So this means both restrained in terms of the volume of your voice, the amount of contact you have outside of the house. Uh, Although there's a big asterisk on this. Here we're talking about upper class women. In lower classes, you had to go outside. Otherwise, you didn't make any money, and women worked. But at any rate, restrained also means that you don't eat too much, you don't drink too much. Interestingly, for a lot of us, this included religious restraint. A lot of Roman men were very concerned about women who were too involved in their religious communities, especially religious communities that they thought of as kind of uh, sketchy. So, for instance, the mysteries of Dionysus, because they involved gatherings in which all social classes hang out together. So you'd have enslaved people interacting with upper class people, men interacting with women. One of the things about the mysteries of Dionysus was everybody is supposed to be equal without respect to their origin or their gender or their status. The idea there was freedom, and this really freaked some Romans out. The No, I'm going to leave that there. There are other religions that get dinged for this too, so stay tuned. There's going to be more about this later. But this is something that you may have seen in Cato the Elder and wondered what was going on with it. There's this one bit where he's talking about how the housekeeper's wife in a plantation or a villa should stay at home and manage the house and shouldn't, I believe your translation says, gad about to religious festivals. That's what he's getting at there. And to us, that sounds weird, right? Um, I'm careful with it because there are a lot of different we's in this virtual room. But Anglo-American mainstream culture, yes. We think of women as being more religiously involved in general. There's this, even in religious traditions where leadership is confined to men, um, we see in the social dynamics of religious communities, women tend to show up more frequently and be more involved. And it's also an outlet that we consider perfectly respectable for women to plug into. So much so that even in communities that are very old school and conservative about what women can and cannot do, we still see a lot of prominent women active within the religious branch of those communities as speakers, as writers, as theologians, as activists. The charming in speech thing comes up a lot, so this doesn't mean that all this modesty and restraint, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't talk. You're supposed to be able to carry on a conversation, communicate sensibly, to be able to hold up your end, and that has a lot to do with this tacit expectation of political and social aid and brokering and social networking. And then this proper and manner thing, this goes with modesty. I'm not going to say more about that. I've included a soundbite that's taken from a Roman tombstone that gives you the cliff notes, yeah? Chaste, obedient, obliging, agreeable, active worker, pious, but not to excess, in dress fashionable, but not glamorous, and altogether discreetly elegant. I mean, gosh darn, that's a lot of contradictory advice right there. Goodness. Okay, I've been talking a lot about the restrictions and restraint on women's lives in the ancient world, but now we've got to push back at this a little bit. Because so far I've been pulling very heavily from the kinds of things that come out of texts written by elite people for elite people, expectations that we see in elite art, remains from elite burials, because elite people's stuff just tends to survive, right? They have the time to write stuff. Elites love to listen to other elites talk. Regular folk don't get as much airtime and don't get enough press, really. So, how do we as historians fill in that bias? Well, we can do this by looking at tombstone remains, at remains from areas that were destroyed in such a way as to preserve remnants of daily life, from graves that contain people who weren't elite. We can tell sometimes from the tombstones. One of the good bits of news for ancient historians is that because of the way Romans prioritized their burial arrangements and the way that trade associations would regularly keep up insurance for funerals, Romans had an expectation of having a tombstone. And this includes enslaved Romans too, but also freed people. One of the things your patron has to do for you is give you a tombstone. And if they don't, they're going to have to explain why. We have some graves that are family cemeteries, and family in the Roman sense means your enslaved people and freed people too, where specific people have been left out of the tomb, and the people who own the tomb feel the need to explain that this is the tomb to all of these people except for you and you and you because you suck. I really want to know what the story is behind some of these, but that's where I'm getting this data. So what we're looking at here are two such pieces of evidence. One of these is a relief sculpture from the tomb of a couple who owned a grocery retailer here in what we now call a wet food market. So they're selling freshly killed animals. That's what's hanging up on the little pole thing there. And then the woman working the counter is actively selling stuff. There's a child there buying stuff. That also might be an enslaved person. Sometimes ancient art would make enslaved people smaller than free people, and then gods would be larger than free people. And like the emperor would be somewhere between gods, free people. So the social status had an impact on size. But if you look on the counter, there are these two naked kids. Those are actual kids, and that's probably the couple's children. So you see, there's a face in the back. It's been worn away a bit. There's some erosion on this art, but the husband is kind of lurking in the back there with the meats, and then his wife is in the front running the counter. And then on the counter, that's very likely their children, or I guess if you want to be really depressing, it might be children they've enslaved, but let's say it's their kids. And that's pretty normalized. So this isn't a culture where children stay out of the workplace. You bring your kids to work. They would have been really confused by the idea of not bringing your kids to work. Similarly, they would have thought it was very bizarre that you're not having your female family members help in the family business. Even in a system where enslaved people are involved in the workforce, you still need all hands on deck to run an ancient business. And only very, very wealthy people could afford to have their women not involved in business. And these are often people who are so wealthy that the men aren't doing business either. Or if they're doing business, it's some kind of multi-million sestertius trade thing. For most folks in the ancient world, then, this meant that marriage was a business and a personal partnership. One of my favorite pieces of art, and this is from Pompeii, it's a fresco portrait showing a baker and his wife. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, I'm so sorry. But you see that the baker is in his white citizen's toga, and his wife next to him has a stylus and a set of wax tablets, and she's wearing this purpley red outfit, really expensive outfit. So they're both there wearing their best citizen gear. And he's got a scroll under his chin. The little red tag hanging off the end of the scroll is how they would put the title on scrolls. Scrolls were not for correspondence or for business writing or even for letter writing. They're for books. And so holding a scroll shows that he doesn't just read for work, but he reads literature for fun. He's an educated man. He's not just a business owner, but he's also active in his community. This is how you show that you're a valuable patron who can be both a business leader and an advocate. And then his wife, with her wax tablet, is showing that she also is literate. She writes, and then likely the idea with the wax tablet is she's managing the business, or at least the correspondence. They're shown at about the same head height, and this is pretty typical for married couples in art. And that's not because there weren't height differentials. We have ancient skeletons. On average, male-bodied people are taller than female-bodied people in antiquity, as with now. So what they're going for is to show that partnership by showing near equality in heights. The same dynamic that makes enslaved people shorter is making spouses about the same size. And that's kind of cool. I find this a bit of a romantic bit of art myself. Now, I've said a lot about the restriction on women's lives, but we are really missing something if we think that even for women who are staying away from male company, that they're not engaged in an active and lively life of the mind, because they are. These are some of many figurines that have been found in women's tombs showing scenes from women's daily lives. These figurines probably represented women as they were when they hung out at home, at least in their idealized version of themselves. We think they end up in tombs as kind of a reminder of what that person did in life. And you have one woman on a couch in the very back there where she's lying down with an upraised hand. Likely the broken off hand was once holding a cup. So she's drinking and feasting at a fancy dinner party. Uh, Not necessarily with men there. She's on the couch alone, so this might be in an all-female party, which we know happened. It seems that within communities, women would be in and out of each other's houses all day. They would pool together and hang out together in order to work, but also to share labor, including the labor of raising children. And this included breastfeeding. So one of the things that irritates me a little bit as a modern historian is the way that modern breastfeeding culture assumes that in historical periods before bottle technology was very good or very reliable, that women would just be stuck, each woman breastfeeding her own baby with her own breasts and no sharing ever. And with that is the assumption that every woman can lactate enough for every child. On average, this is true. However, not always. In the ancient world and in the modern world, just as now, some women didn't produce as much milk than others. Some women produced way too much milk and had surplus. This isn't a bug, it's a feature, because it seems that human women, no, I'm going to go with evolved here because we see this in many, many human societies, evolved to share breastfeeding duties. Some people can do it a lot, some people not so well. And this is meant to build redundancy into the system. Romans pointed out, and they're a little bit right about this, that it's important that a baby be used to nursing from different sources so that this is a more ancient practicality than a modern, thank goodness, that if the mother dies, you want to make sure that the baby is still going to drink from somebody else. So therefore, some Roman women, and this there was an ancient version of mommy wars based around this. Some Roman women were hardcore, like, I breastfeed my own babies all myself. I don't get any wet nurses because I am extra. But most Roman women, and by the way, I'm not knocking that, like, that's so cool. If that works for you, hats off. Awesome. But not for everybody is this practical. For most Roman women, then, if they were middle to lower class, they would pool their resources together and they would share breastfeeding duties amongst each other. If they were more wealthy, and here's where it gets less nice, you would buy someone who would be your child's wet nurse and then would be the primary caregiver for that child. So this isn't a completely non-toxic childcare environment. It's just not a situation in which they think it's weird to share breastfeeding. A couple other notes about what's going on in these figurines. Some of these figurines are male. The little guy with the panpipes in the middle to near distance, and there's a little crouching figure in the back. These, however, aren't human men. These are satyrs who are companions of Dionysus or Bacchus. Dionysus imagery shows up in a lot of graves, and we think that's part of the attraction of the mysteries of Dionysus. It's not just about getting drunk with people and no social stratification, but they also felt that Dionysus could get you a better afterlife experience. So that's what's up with that. So let's see, we've got a woman reading from a scroll in the back. The scroll means the same thing for the woman in the middle right as it did for the man with the scroll posing with his wife. It means she's reading literature. There's a woman playing a lyre. A lyre is a fancy instrument. It's the instrument of Apollo, of classical music versus popular music. And to play the lyre means that you have epic poetry memorized. But there's another woman with double pipes. This was also something that was considered a slightly more lowbrow instrument and was a little bit sexualized when women played it. But sometimes you like playing double-reeded instruments. I myself played bassoon. It's fun. Let's see, anything else? Oh, there's another scroll reader. Her paper has broken, but the woman who looks like she's holding two sticks on her lap, that's a scroll she's reading. And then, of course, the one in the middle, this may or may not be a female figure, by the way. The long sleeves, the hairstyle, and the robe are typical both of women, but also of some depictions of the god Dionysus. But it's also the way that intersex people are depicted. So this is a non-binary figurine in the midst of all of the rest, likely again associated with the cult of Dionysus. On to the practicalities of a Roman marriage. For this, we have to revisit briefly, I promise, the toxic ass example of the Sabine women. Um, you guys remember this from quiz 1. I'm not going to go through it again. But this mythological underpinning of the first Roman marriages, these abductions, are echoed in some of the things we see happening at Roman wedding ceremonies. So keep that in mind, it's coming up. Now, on to the legal practicalities. Roman marriage, as I mentioned earlier, does have a legal component in as much as if you're both citizens, it's recognized by the state. And eventually there is a paperwork procedure by which you can record marriages. But initially, and for all of Roman history essentially, if you agree that you're married, you're married. There are ceremonies around it, but all that Roman legality requires is consent of the parents. And if you're above a certain age, consent of the parties involved. Now, with this consent, there are two broad categories of marriage. These have Latin names that I've given to you because they show up a lot in other sources, and if you see this reading about Romans in your future life, I want you to know what it means. Cum manu is also called a manus marriage. The word manus gives us manual in English, and it means your hand. So a marriage that comes with your hand doesn't mean like a severed hand. It's not that. And it doesn't refer to the joining of hands as such. We talked about that earlier, and you see it in our art here where this is a couple, they're getting married. You know they're getting married because they're holding hands, and that's what couples do to cement their marriage. But legally speaking, you could have a marriage with hand or without hand. And what they mean is not the joining of the hands itself, but rather legal guardianship. A manus marriage is a marriage in which the husband takes on the role of the pater familias. So this is the only situation in which your father is no longer the main authority in your life, but rather your husband. Uh, Even in very strict manus marriages, you might still have your own property and some separations, but essentially a manus marriage is marriage as we think of it in a Victorian possession sense. And in many ways, this resembles modern legal marriage a little bit more than does the other kind of marriage. This was not a common kind of marriage through most of the periods we're focusing on. While in very early Rome, and here we're talking like the early Republic, like the 4th, 5th, maybe 3rd century BCE, by the time we get even to the Punic Wars, most marriages, the majority of marriages, are not this kind of marriage. The only people who had to have this kind of marriage were patricians in certain kinds of priesthoods, which is a tiny percentage of the Roman population. The other kind of marriage, the kind that the majority of Romans have, is one called sine manu. The sine means without, a marriage without possession, without a hand. You still shake hands at your wedding, but what this means is that when you, as a Roman man, marry a woman, you no longer, or rather, she still is her father's property. In other words, you do not then become her legal guardian. You don't get to make decisions about her future, about the state of the marriage, anything that has to do with her, her property, her money, her legal interests, that has to go through her father. Now, in order for a marriage to continue to be sine manu, a marriage without manus, you had to spend at least 3 nights a year apart. And so regularly Roman couples would schedule 3 nights where the wife would go sleep at a friend's house or go crash on her dad's couch or whatever arrangements they had to make. If they were really rich, she'd go stay in the summer house for a couple days. And that's all you had to do to keep a marriage sine manu. Now, technically, some marriages would eventually lapse into a manus marriage, but it seems that most couples continued to act like a sine manu marriage was in force because there are some protections in here for both parties. So, in a marriage sine manu, property is kept strictly divided, and there is also a division of powers that makes divorce a lot easier. On to the kinds of marriage ceremonies. Now, I'm going to start with the first, which is for most of the periods we're talking about, the least commonly done one. However, this is the most influential one in the history of marriage in cultures that lean on Rome a little bit. And that is confarreatio, which means a marriage with a cake. You see where this is going, I think. This was a marriage where you eat cake. And the eating of marriage cakes goes right to here. The thing that you would do in a confarreatio marriage to show that you were now one household was, well, you'd share a cake. I don't know if you'd smash it in each other's faces or not. And this wasn't necessarily a sweet cake, like maybe just a really fancy bread. Refined sugar wasn't a thing. It would be often made with honey, but there's also this cool honey cheesecake Roman thing, which you can find recipes on the internet for. It is apparently delicious. I haven't had it myself, but it looks nifty. This was a very formal wedding, and again, this is mostly senatorial classes, but you've seen one of these. This was the marriage that they showed in that docudrama about Tiberius Gracchus. This has the fancy red or orange veil and the fire and the water. One of the things that you do to show that your wife is now in charge of your household is that you give her fire and water, which are the two components of housekeeping. You need fire to cook and function with, and then you need water to wash stuff with. It makes sense. The next kind of marriage, which is by far the most common, is the coemptio, and this is a fun one. This is a fake bride purchase. You wouldn't use any large amount of money. This seems to have grown out of an earlier kind of marriage, though, where you would buy the bride from her father. And this eventually gets downgraded to just this nominal payment, like you give him 50 cents and there the marriage is official. This is carried over in some wedding ceremonies today. I'm sure you can think of examples. One of the things I had at my wedding is I had a silver dollar that I put into my shoe that brides in my family had used since, oh gosh, I don't know how old that thing was. I should have looked at the date. It's too late now. So at any rate, this one has a lot of legs on it, and it's a pretty popular one for other cultures too, for various reasons. Probably it has its roots in the idea that marriage is a business relationship as much as it is a domestic partnership. Finally, and this seems to be the most common across all demographic brackets, including the upper class, but mostly lower class folks, is a kind of marriage called usus, which is just the Roman word for use or habit. Marriage by habit is what we now call a common law marriage. That is, you just move in together and you act like you're married, so you're married. This is a popular one. We still kind of low-key use this one. It's a classic for a reason. It's very low mess, low cost, low drama, and weddings are expensive, so go you if you go for usus. Now, about the dowry. Dowry means different things in different cultures, so it's important to pause for a minute and talk what it means to Romans specifically. The dowry was a sum of money that was given to a new bride as her security fallback. And for Romans, this was money that the spouse cannot touch under any circumstances. There are strong legal protections that make it impossible for a husband to ever touch the wife's dowry. Even if she gives parts of it to him as a gift, there are rules that restrict the amount that she can give him, and this is meant to protect women from being pressured into giving their dowry to their spouse. This is something that Romans take pretty seriously, and one of the things that I give them mad props for. This was also not money that your pater familias could necessarily touch either. Once you married, this is meant to be your money. Now, there are circumstances in which you can lose your dowry, and this is where it gets less happy news. If you are found to have cheated, then your spouse can sue to keep the dowry as payment for your breach of contract, as it were. But for the most part, your dowry is your dowry. And this was something that women use as the empire goes on to build nest eggs and create their own fortunes. You start to get a lot of independently wealthy women, and this feature of the dowry is a thing that allows women to do this. So for once, the word dowry is mostly happy news. The next thing to come along, and this is a law enacted under the Emperor Augustus. So this is right at the turn of the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, that kind of awkward breach period. Augustus enacts a series of laws that are meant to encourage upper class Romans, but Romans in general, to get married and to make lots and lots of Roman babies. He had to do this for several reasons. One of them was that, well, the 1st century BCE was wall-to-wall civil war, and upper class Romans had been absolutely decimated. Entire families were gone, and very few of them that survived were that interested in having a lot of kids, because why have kids to die in a civil war? Also, the way that wills were structured, in some ways it's a nice thing. Roman wills divided property equally amongst siblings. All siblings, not just male siblings. But because of this, Romans seem to have avoided having a lot of extra kids, uh, both by using birth control and somewhat exposure, but that probably not so much. Scholars are divided on the degree to which infanticide was a go-to family planning method. I think the evidence is largely in favor of seeing it as a rare thing, um, but like many rare things that are still options available, some ancient people seem to have been more up for it than others. Um, One of the bits of evidence you'll see referred to sometimes, we found a letter from Roman Egypt where a husband writes to his wife and says, when the baby's born, if the baby's male, keep it. If it's female, expose it. But that's just one dude, and I don't think one dude an entire social norm makes, because quite frankly, abusive asshats are everywhere. So, just leave me my illusions, guys. Let me think that most of the family planning going on was from the birth control side. However, I'm a medical historian, and I can tell you that, yeah, they had a lot of methods for family planning, none of which I would recommend that you try, but some of them would have had a certain effectiveness. And infant mortality was very, very high. So high, in fact, that we know of families where they tried very hard to have lots of extra kids, and so many died in childhood that only a few survived. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, were 2 of 12. They were the only two who lived to adulthood. The disease rate in the city of Rome was sky high. Even if they weren't killing each other on the regular, they still would have had a population problem. And this leads me to the other reason that this law I'm about to talk about gets enacted. Namely, because so many people from older Roman families were now dead, and so many of the people who were currently filling in the Roman population were the children of enslaved people, immigrants, or a combination thereof, there was a lot of panic amongst the Roman upper class that, oh my gosh, we're being replaced. it was too late by then, of course. Population, as I've said, and genetic marker testing has shown us that by then, pretty much everybody in Rome was operating on Near Eastern and North African DNA models. Nevertheless, the facts never stopped anyone from having a moral panic, especially if they're a minority in power. Enter the jus trium liberorum, which is translated as the law of three children, which is exactly what it sounds like. That is, if you're a woman and you have three babies, then you can now be your own legal agent. So in other words, if you have three children, and they don't all have to live, just if you give birth to three children, they don't even have to be live births. If you give, like, they count late-term pregnancy loss, so you have three babies of some kind or other. Boom, awesome, go you. You no longer need a legal guardian. This means that, so the legal guardian grows out of the paterfamilias. If your paterfamilias dies, your nearest male relative is supposed to protect you from being victimized by the legal system. The assumption is that he's going to have more legal education than you do, so he's going to be able to keep you from being taken advantage of. What it means in practice for a lot of women was that they had to get a man to sign off on business contracts, on lawsuits and breach of payment, the regular stuff you need to run a business. So what we start seeing is that with the jus trium liberorum, women with three children win and exercise the right to file their own lawsuits, make their own donations, sign their own business deals. And this becomes such a thing that almost immediately women begin applying to be granted the right of having three children, even if they haven't had three children. The first person to do this is the Emperor Augustus's wife. So the same emperor that comes up with the rule, his wife like magically gets the right of three children, even though she only had two. But the reason was given, well, I mean, she's the empress. She's done so much for the state. Obviously, she can be trusted to handle public business. Also, she was signing all of Augustus's mail while he was out of town. So, yeah, she needed to get paid, and she did. But then other women start petitioning the courts to have this right, and then it's regularly given out. So you don't necessarily have to have three babies, and you don't have to be elite either, because there's also a measure where if you are a freed woman, so even if you have been enslaved at some point in your life, you can still win this right. You just have to have four babies and not three. However, you could have had them while you were still enslaved, so any baby counts no matter what your freedom status is, and it can be retroactive. So once you're free, if you have four children, awesome, go you, you can have the right. Men can have this too. There's certain perks for them as well, but this really shines when it comes to women's access to the legal system and its business protections. A little less happily, there is adultery, which is something that Romans were really, really nervous about, especially upper class Romans. Partly because upper class Romans began to use weaponized adultery as a way to attack their political rivals and opponents. One of the best examples of this, really exhibit A for weaponized adultery, is Julius Caesar, who is a great example of pretty much everything. Julius Caesar regularly would seduce his political rivals' wives and then brag about it in order to humiliate them. Um, these relationships all seem to be consensual, so yay. But nonetheless, this was considered to be a real problem. And when Roman elite men worried about adultery, they're kind of worried about their wives, but because of the way that Romans think about gender, there was this perception that although, yeah, women can exercise self-control, but here's where ancient sexism looks a lot different from modern sexism. Romans thought that men were better at exercising self-control than women. They thought that women enjoyed sex more. Some Romans, and Greeks too, thought that women physically need sex, and if they don't have enough of it, they'll die. This was an actual medical question that doctors debated back and forth. Um, for men, there was no idea that you have to have sex or else your health will suffer. There is this idea that any sex is too much sex, so you really have to keep a lid on it. And for that reason, men who had too much sex, however their enemies chose to define too much sex, were slut shamed and stigmatized. Not that women weren't slut shamed too, but it's something that happens in a male flavor for Romans as well. Now, a lot of this depends on the social status of the people that you're sleeping with. It was considered less of a problem if you were sleeping around too much with enslaved people and sex workers. And I use people deliberately. There is some stigmatization of male on male sexual activity, but for a Roman man who is acting as top, and if you don't know what I mean by that, Google will explain, that wasn't considered particularly bad on the scale of things that could get you embarrassed if news about it came out. In fact, some Roman men were perfectly happy to brag about their prowess in penetrating anyone, but you're supposed to penetrate people of lower social status. Similarly, then, it was thought to be deviant sex if you were sleeping with another man's wife, not because it was a crime against her, but it was considered that you'd only do that because you didn't like her husband. Like, there's this assumption that it's all about the guys involved. More about that in a minute. This also meant that for a Roman woman, adultery for her husband didn't mean her husband was sleeping with someone else, but if her husband was seducing someone else's wife, then maybe she could get her paterfamilias to sue for a divorce, although no-fault divorce is also a thing in this society, so it's not as vital. And it's not like she gets any extra money from his dowry, because he doesn't have a dowry. But in general, that could be a socially acceptable cause to initiate divorce. But then also, if her husband enjoyed certain kind of sex that was found to be deviant, so if he liked to be the bottom in a sexual relationship, uh, not necessarily the bottom to just men, like they thought that if the woman's on top of you, that's kind of deviant. And it seems that some men really liked that and then got shamed for liking it, which is interesting. So that's one of the kinds of causes that you could bring up if you're a woman with a man and you're trying to prove cheating. But in general, if you want a divorce and your father's on board, you're pretty okay. And if you don't have to go through a male guardian, well then, off you go. In general, though, adultery was a situation that was felt to be a man-on-man crime, and because of this, when you were taking legal routes to dealing with adultery, you would go after the man that your wife cheated with first, but then you could also and were legally required to also go after your wife. At one point, the strictest form of legislation against adultery, and this was Augustus again, held that if you found out your wife was cheating and you don't take her to court, then you yourself can be prosecuted for being a pimp, because it was assumed, well, if you're okay with your wife sleeping with other men, then obviously you're trafficking her. An incredible train of logic right there. And actual ancient Romans thought that that was crazy troll logic. Yes, that's about all I have to say about that. Oh, no, it's not all I have to say about that. There's more about this law. So this is the strictest law for adultering. And this, I've given you the Latin here. What this means, the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, the Julia, laws were named after the person who introduced them. We still do this, right? We have bills like the McCain-Feingold bill for campaign finance reform. So the Lex Julia the Julia part is from Gaius Julius Caesar Jr. So Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar, and that's why his family name is still Julia. But this is super ironic, right? Because Julius Caesar was one of the most famous adulterers of ancient history. His heir decided to really overcorrect. He was almost like pathologically fixated on stopping adultery, so much so that he calls this law the Julian law, right? Augustus's law about adulterers. The full name of the law is the Julian law about the adulterers who must be stopped, which is just a great law. It's my favorite law name from the ancient world, or ever. And as I mentioned, this is all about man on man crime first, and then you punish the woman later. I mentioned the thing about pandering and pimping, so if you don't prosecute, then you're in trouble. Double jeopardy does apply. So if you sue the man for adultery first and he's acquitted, you cannot then go after the woman for adultery. However, if the man is found guilty, it's probably not going to go well for the woman. However, you're legally required to sue the man first. Now, so far, this sounds sensible. Here is where, for ancient Romans, this began to really go off the rails. Because it wasn't just the people involved in the adultery who were liable. If your friend commits adultery and you know about it and don't inform on them, you could be sued. If you let somebody use your house for adultery, you can be sued. If someone has adultery on your couch and you find out about it and don't report them, you can be sued. If you maybe sort of know that somebody might be committing adultery but don't do anything about it, you can be sued. Likewise, anybody is allowed to accuse anybody of adultery. What this means is that the court load for adultery cases goes through the roof, so much that they have to build a purpose court where they have a panel of judges that are constantly impaneled hearing adultery cases 24/7. So the drama potential for this is massive. It's also a great thing for entertainment. Ancient Roman trials for criminal law, which this was, were public. So people would go and popcorn to upper class people's adultery drama. Now, to limit this a bit, there was a 5-year statute of limitations. So if you cheat on your spouse and nobody finds out about it for 5 years, you are in the clear. Now, also, if you have adultery with somebody's wife, the wife dies, you can still sue the man for adultery, but only for 5 years. Now, this law was eroded almost as soon as it was passed. There was protest poetry. People ended up exiled for the protests, including, and here's where this gets sad again. I'm so sorry. This is a depressing lecture. Augustus's daughter, who was named Julia, because that's how Roman names work. Remember, they're not very creative about this. So Julius Caesar, massive horn dog. Augustus, legislative overcompensator. Augustus's daughter Julia was an intellectual leader and one of the opposition leaders to many of her father's policies, including this one. She had been married off to a series of politically convenient husbands, one of whom, Agrippa, was much older than her, and then her final spouse, Tiberius, was by all accounts abusive, and not even by all accounts. Her life ends in a way that makes it very clear that he was an abusive a-hole. Julia was one of the first people accused of adultery, prosecuted publicly, and all of the people involved were subsequently exiled, including Julia. She was sent to an island called Panatria. It's a very, very small island in the Aegean, so small that it can't grow its own food, so all of her food had to be shipped in. She was kept in isolation. And then when her father died, the new emperor was her ex-husband Tiberius. The first thing Tiberius did almost when he became emperor was he stopped the shipments of food to Julia's island, at which point she starved to death in exile, which is why I am fairly certain that it's historically valid to call Tiberius abusive, because that was abusive. So this has a really sad ending, but there's some good news here too. This is not how all Romans felt about sex and sexuality. A lot of Romans thought this was too much. A lot of Romans deviated from the standards, some publicly, some privately, with more or less degrees of hypocrisy. Just like any society, people are people. You're going to find a wide range of acceptance levels and safeness. But then there's also this icky dynamic about sleeping with people's spouses to do revenge things, and that's gross. Next. There we go. On that happy note, let's talk about wedding clothes. Yay! So if that hasn't scared you off from getting Roman married, more power to you. Here's how you do it. The bridal dress was an outfit that was worn only by brides. Certain elements of it were also worn by the Vestal Virgins. The base garment was a thing called a tunica recta, which is Latin for a straight tunic. So this is a particular kind of tunic that doesn't have sleeves on it and doesn't nip in at the waist a bit. So it's a straight up and down tunic that's just two rectangles of cloth with holes for the arms and the neck. It's considered a very modest way of dressing, very concealing. Then the belt is tied in this specific knot that we're not sure what it was, but oh, that was a horrible pun, wasn't it? Oh dear. It was called the Knot of Hercules, and this was based on a myth in which one of Hercules' labors, when he was sent around to do all of these things for the gods for reasons that are complicated and not relevant here, one of them was to untie, or rather steal, this Amazon queen's belt. And apparently the belt was unstealable because it was tied in a knot that nobody could untie. So the way he did this was he hung out with the Queen of the Amazons, formed a relationship with her, and talked her into untying her own damn belt. Which is one of the more wholesome things Heracles ever did, really. Roman brides, in a nod to that tradition, then, were supposed to wear a belt that was tied in this special, very difficult to untie knot. It was meant to be symbolic of her fidelity and her chastity, as well as modesty. And then she would cover her hair with a red veil, kind of a carnelian orangey red. The word for it in Latin is flammeum, which is flame colored. It was meant to look like the rippling fire. It's part of this whole fire theme with Roman weddings. She's given the gift of fire. She has fire on her head. Fire on your head is an omen, is big in Roman religious rites. And our reenactors are here demonstrating what this outfit looks like in person. And here's also a picture of the traditional hairdo under your flammeum veil. This is the sine crines hairstyle that's worn both by brides and by Vestal Virgins. It's a very old way of hairdressing that involves wrapping your hair around a woolen baseband and then sewing your braids into this crown configuration that then is covered with your veil and your headdress and so on. Roman men, they just wear their toga. Hopefully they took a bath. It's considered polite. Onto the ceremony itself, and here we're looking at another piece of art showing these. These were really common scenes to put on people's tombstones, especially if you're being buried as a married couple. And that's not a coincidence. Romans thought of death and marriage as these two very important rites of passage in a full person's life, but they also thought of marriage as a kind of death. Not so much for men here, but it's through the eyes of women that you go from growing up in your father's house to living in your husband's house. It's disconcerting. It's difficult. It's a kind of social death where you have to reform your social network and you have to rethink yourself in this new context. And then you also have to do this while physically having children, which is a lot of work. All of this reshapes your idea of yourself and your personhood in a way that was felt to be useful when people dealt with their fear of death in antiquity. They thought of death as an inescapable thing, that's disconcerting, but it's not the end. That with death comes trauma, yes, but also opportunity, newness, and this hope of life in a new household, now in the house of Hades in the underworld. So, what we're looking at here is the groom with one of his friends. Often he'd bring his companions to kind of cheer him on and be his attendants. Women too would have attendants. And then behind them is the officiant, the pronuba. This had to be a woman whose husband was still alive, who had only been married to that one guy. Preferably, she'd have living children, but that's kind of hard to find in Rome. So, having a living husband that you've only been married to is rare enough. And she would be the person who would direct the marriage ceremony. For all that there are a lot of patriarchal features to this, there's a lot of woman-led and woman-centered rite and ritual here too, and this has to do with the balance between the man's power outside of the house and the woman's power inside. As I've mentioned, the moment where the two become a couple is at the clasping of right hands. You'll sometimes see this in Latin, dextrarum junctio, which is just the joining of the right hands. It's same words. At that point, the new husband would then say to his wife, ubi tu Gaius ego, or sorry, the wife would say to her husband, ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. This is the female form of the name Gaius. Gaius still gives us the word guy in English as a generic word for a dude. It's an actual Roman's name, Gaius. Caesar was a Gaius. But it's a really common Roman name, so it's a way of saying, if your name's Bob, I'm Bobette. If your name's Frank, I'm Frankie. However you want to do this. And then in some versions of the ceremony, then the man would say, ubi tu Gaia ego Gaius, but not always. This was more a thing that the woman would say. At this point, if we're in a citizen marriage where there's a lot of property at stake, you would sign the marriage contract. This would include things like the amount of the dowry, the divorce terms, what you get as your protections for widowhood. Usually the husband's a little bit older than the wife. This becomes more common the higher you go in the social strata. So the assumption was that the husband will die first, leaving the wife a widow, and uh, that's why this contract looks this way. But also women needed more legal protections because, again, the patriarchy. The woman would often hold in her hands during the ceremony a spindle and distaff in order to show her willingness to bring her work and her effort to the household. This is held in the same way that we now hold bundles of flowers and things. It's kind of a missed opportunity, actually. I wish I'd brought my spindle and distaff to my wedding. Oh well. Maybe at our anniversary. There's a procession as part of this too. Usually the procession happens before this ceremony. Sometimes the ceremony will happen and then there's the procession taking the bride to the groom's house. But the usual order is that the groom shows up at the bride's house, picks her and the wedding party up. They have a procession through the streets, usually after dark, with torches. During this procession, there was a traditional thing that people would yell to congratulate the couples, which was tallasio, which means absolutely nothing in Latin. It's just a traditional thing. So the Romans' story for why they yell tallasio is that at the Sabine women's abduction, there was this really wealthy dude named Talasius who had marked out this specific Sabine woman who was really super hot. But he was too important to grab her himself, so he deputizes all of his friends to grab her for him. And so while they're running with her through the streets, they're yelling, Tallasio, Tallasio, which is Latin for, she's for Talasius, she's for Talasius. We saw her first. Oh, sigh. All right. When you got to your new spouse's house, the doorway would then be touched with certain ritual items. You would paint it with oil and often wool with lanolin. This was in order to provide a ritual cleansing to the home, but also to reinforce this tie between wool and woolworking and the presence of a woman in the house. What this meant, though, was that you'd now just put this whole giant greasy slippery mess all around your threshold, and your threshold was usually made out of tiles or marble, which is very, very slippery if you grease it. At this point, then, because it was a really bad omen if you fall on your face when you're walking into your new spouse's house, the husband would pick up the bride, carry her over the threshold so she didn't fall down and make a bad omen. So if you've wondered where that's from, that's what that is. We do it because Romans. I've mentioned the fire and water thing. That's what happens next. There's the joining of the hands. You're married now. Yay. There's a party. Sometimes everybody hangs out and has a party while you consummate the marriage in a private room. Sometimes people just stand outside of your window and then they sing creepy songs at you because that puts people in the mood. It sounds a little bit odd, but we still have poems from that ritual. At this point, the norm of the Roman happy family takes over. What's supposed to happen is that everybody gets along, cooperates together, builds their power base, and then hands it down to the next generation. This is the kind of family that Romans regularly showed in their art on their tombstones, sort of. However, some tombstones, especially when we get out of elite tombstones, tend to be pretty voluble about the drama that ends up happening at the end of these marriages. There's one where a husband had freed an enslaved woman that he owned in order to marry her. They have a baby together, the baby dies, and then she runs away and quits the marriage. So his tombstone awkwardly already had her name on it, so he had to like get somebody to knock her name off of the tombstone, and then on the back there's this explanatory inscription that says like, yeah, she ran off, the baby died, I'm sad, she sucks. And now we know about his drama because it's on his tombstone. Similarly, we have tombstones set up. This is a little bit more depressing. I'm sorry in advance for this, but we have some that are dedicated by grieving parents because their daughter was married in an abusive situation and then was subsequently killed by her husband. Uh, like modern families, this can get very messy. And it's not just messy at the bottom of society either. In fact, it gets even more messy the closer you get to power, because powerful families have two competing goals. You need to raise children who will take over and continue your dynasty, but if you have more than one, that tends to be a problem because, well, usually there can only be one emperor. They experiment with having more than one emperor, but it never works out for reasons that I'm sure you can imagine. And this is what we're looking at with our art here. So the first is a carved cameo showing the imperial family all together. This is Geta and Caracalla's parents, I think. Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, if I remember correctly. So a couple of family portraits here. This is a rare one where you can still see the two little boys' faces. On this other one, you'll notice that there's dad, there's mom, there's one little baby, and then this other kid has had his face knocked out. That's because the other little boy grew up to be emperor, had his brother assassinated, and then had him erased from the historical record in a custom called damnatio memoriae, or the canceling of memory, which is what you're looking at the results of here. Only, like most awkwardly erased people from family portraits, it's super obvious what happened here. They're not fooling anyone. So on to the children then. With elite families, there's a lot of what you'd expect from elite families. So the sons are meant to continue the family name, to grow up to be the future pater familias. Daughters are meant to grow up to create marriage alliances, but they can also be heirs too. If you don't have any male children, your daughter can carry the family name, and eventually we do see women passing down their names to uh, multiple offspring in order to keep up continuity. So it's not necessarily as neat and tidy as this makes it look. The children are supposed to tend the family tomb, and at the parentalia, which is an annual celebration, a little bit like the Day of the Dead in Mexico, you go to the tombs of your ancestors, you honor them, you hang out with them, you remember them. And this isn't just an elite thing, of course, but it's easier if you can afford a tomb. And this is part of why you have children. They're also supposed to support you when you get older, although there isn't ever a point at which your children can legally substitute for you if you're alive and an adult, unless you're declared incompetent, and that's a very difficult process. If you're poor, your children work inside the home and contribute to the family business, or if you are poor and also enslaved, then you work as soon as you're physically able to. And we have ample evidence of that happening, both literary evidence, inscriptional evidence, artifacts, and bodies themselves of children whose bones show markers from extremely heavy labor, lifting loads that are way too big for them, way too young. And it's no coincidence that these are on bones of children because, well, that's not a really great way to not die in childhood, to put additional stress onto your body. Uh, Although some of them died in the eruption of Vesuvius, to be fair. So it's not all regular childhood mortality. Sometimes it's a volcano, but most people don't die of a volcano in antiquity. Puberty is an important milestone in your childhood, but it doesn't necessarily end your childhood completely. Most girls marry sometime around puberty. For elite women, this tends to happen earlier because that marriageable property is a good bit of your value to your family, both your social and your financial value. So the pattern is that as soon as a girl is feasibly old enough to get married, even if she hasn't started her periods yet, we do find examples of a sizable minority being married off among the elites. However, ancient doctors were aware, and ancient people were aware too, that it isn't really healthy for very young women to be having babies. So it is more normal to see girls being married after they start having their periods. In antiquity, that average seems to be about the year at age 14. But the majority of women are marrying later even than that because it was recognized that even 14 is a little early. So 16, 17, 18 is a more normal age for marriage in women. For men, things are a little bit more complicated. When a boy turns 14, he takes off his bulla. We've seen the bulla necklace before in the Etruscan section of the first lecture, but in case you forgot, there's another one in the side. Upper class Roman boys were given these necklaces in the shape of a bull's testicle, which is why they're called a bulla, a bull like bull. And this is meant to protect them from the evil eye and from harmful interference, from disease, that sort of thing. When you reach 14, you take that off, and then you put on your grown-up adult toga, which is a plain toga without decoration on it. As you run for political office, you add things to your toga, but at 14, you just get your basic man toga. However, much like a bar mitzvah, this doesn't necessarily mean that you are now a full adult, even though part of the whole point of having the ceremony is now you are a man, only you're not actually. You're not a legal adult until you're 25. Under the age of 25, you can't enter into contracts. You can't become part of a loan agreement. So, like, student loans wouldn't have been a thing for ancient Romans. Your father is legally responsible for all of that. At the age of 25, you have some limited emancipation. You can own some of your own property, you can run your own business. For girls, there's no real puberty ceremony that is distinct from marriage. You are effectively a child until you marry, and then you're a woman. So it's a little less complicated. Part of the marriage ceremonies for your first wedding would involve taking your dolls and dedicating them to a temple of a goddess, Hestia, Hera, Venus, anything that's a marriage adjacent goddess will do. There were several culture wars about what was the best way to have and raise children in antiquity, and a lot of them haven't changed much. I alluded to the one about wet nurses. A lot of Roman women were very divided about who should feed your baby and how. For those of you who are curious about this, bottle feeding was also an option on the table, including bottle feeding with animal milk, which was sometimes done for abandoned children if you couldn't find a woman who was lactating. So just because you can't find someone to breastfeed a kid doesn't mean the kid will automatically die. We also have evidence that this was used to feed difficult to feed children because not all children naturally latch, particularly if you're born a little bit early. I'm just putting that out there because this happened with my son and it was hugely surprising and really difficult. So if you need to hear this, here it is. Some babies just never figure out how a boob works. And that's okay. They're perfectly fine babies. And they wouldn't have died in ancient Rome. They just have to use terracotta bottles that would often be used with a little wool wick. It's a very inefficient way to feed babies milk, but you could still do it. Some women who had trouble keeping up a milk supply would let animals nurse on them, like baby pigs, baby sheep, cows, probably not cows. There aren't a lot of specifics on this, but I know about it because I work on ancient obstetrics and gynecology, so there's a fun fact, enjoy that. Another thing that there was a lot of conflict over was who should have contraception and whether or not it should be used within marriage. Now, never was there an attempt to ban contraception. Similarly, abortion was not safe and was never, at one point, it was legally stigmatized and problematized, but it was never fully illegal. We know from various sources that contraception and abortion were both widely and routinely used, so it was definitely an option on the table. Now, it wasn't something that ancient people didn't have debates about the ethics of it, and if you think contraception and abortion is okay, then under what circumstances is it okay to contracept and abort? All of this debate continues in the ancient world and in the modern world, and in the same shapes. Some of it revolved around the point at which a fetus achieves humanity and full human rights, the degree to which a woman's right to safety can be balanced against the interests of the fetus and the baby. This is something that is even more pressing in the ancient world because childbirth was dangerous. Maternal mortality was very high. This is something that's still not safe, especially in the United States as it happens. Maternal mortality is a real issue, and it's not always safe, and you don't always know that you're going to be safe either, which is just to say, be prudent, make sure you get proper health care, and advocate for universal access to health care, especially for women, because it's necessary. At any rate, this is even more depressing in the ancient world because of the high mortality rate. A lot of children didn't survive infancy for a variety of reasons, both having to do with urbanization if you were in the countryside, this picture is a little bit less grim because the higher density population you have with the poorer sanitation, the worse it is for children with developing immune systems. I mean, we're kind of living through that right now. But also, children themselves are incubators for other kinds of diseases, much like what we're going through with COVID-19 now. It's not that children aren't carriers and the disease can't mutate in children, but it doesn't affect them as much, so they provide additional vectors, which is why it's important that your kids stay home, as I remind myself every day, as my son yells at me when I'm trying to record lectures. Sorry, back to the lecture. Okay. But if you're in an urban center, then your children are in persistent and constant contact with other children, and they're also in contact with streets that are poorly cleaned. There's raw sewage in the street, human and animal. Your markets are wet markets, so you have a variety of animal species all huddling together with a bunch of humans, many of whom are poorly nourished, a lot of whom are homeless. And then you also have a healthcare system that um, is still working out how the human body works, let alone how its payment structures work. And you're sitting on a malarial basin. This means that children in the city of Rome died at a very high rate. Now, you'll sometimes hear people say that because infant mortality was higher in pre-modern periods, that it was more normalized, therefore people got over it a bit better, it wasn't as traumatic. And quite frankly, I call bullshit on that for humanism reasons, but also because that's not what the evidence says. One of the most heartbreaking things about being an ancient historian who reads inscriptions is that so many of them are these inscriptions written by heartbroken parents for their very young children who've died sometimes at days old, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years old. Um, and some of them, and it's not just elite people who are heartbroken over their children. We have enslaved people mourning their children and paying what little money they can for a tombstone, or lobbying their enslavers to pinch out for a tombstone in a, I'm not going to call that best case because there's nothing good about that. Uh, you have ancient people, grieving for years over the loss of their children. We have poetry about parents decades later remembering the loss of those kids. And it's not just the high child mortality, but also the high mortality of mothers really wears on families. You know, ancient men aren't sociopaths. I know I've been a little hard on ancient men here, but we have pervasive evidence of men being absolutely heartbroken when their wives die giving birth, or when their wives die in issues related to childbearing. Some women died from poisoning in the process of trying to abort a pregnancy that was threatening their health. That's a thing we know that happened because their male relatives are heartbroken. Um, we have tombstone after tombstone of men grieving their dead wives left to raise their children alone. We have grandmothers mourning for their lost child even while they have their grandchildren. It's um, just because a tragedy is common and shared, it doesn't mean that's not a tragedy. Just because a trauma is common or normal or something that comes out of an otherwise okay event, like surviving a near-death experience in a medical crisis, say, or um, going through a difficult birth, just because that's an experience that is considered a positive contribution that you're praised for, just like um, trauma in war is still a trauma, even if your society praises you for your service, yeah? It's still a trauma. It still weighs on people. And we see evidence of deep damage and scars and grief coming from ancient people who are living with this reality. And we forget this at our peril, folks. this is a talk that I normally give when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, so I'm going to try to moderate this a little bit so it's not completely depressing. But it's something I find myself using to think with too. Um, what we're going through now is something that ancient people could really relate to. The uncertainty, the slowly unfolding disaster, watching an illness that's new to your population come closer and closer. This is something ancient people dealt with. This is something they had trouble processing. They dealt with disruptions in their society that were caused by epidemics and diseases. They dealt with the uncertainty of how to best protect your family in a situation where you can't always, where your system isn't strong enough to hold you through it. And the somewhat comforting thing here is that they did rally. They got through it. They found ways of dealing with it, and we can take some comfort in their company. But we can also learn from our moment right now in this throwback quasi-ancient world of disease, because we're not like them in some ways. There are things we can fix. We know how germs work now. We know what coronavirus looks like. Ancient people didn't. They knew that proximity had something to do with disease, but they didn't quite know how. Was it bad odors? Was it uncleanliness? Um, we have access to things that can make it a lot better for us. And we have choices that, while inconvenient and difficult and still kind of traumatizing, at least let us have some control over the situation. But even 100 years ago, we were in a world where there weren't vaccines for most common illnesses. When you think back to your elementary school class, before vaccines, by the time you got to high school, um, 4 or 5 of your friends from your elementary school class would be dead, and that's a conservative estimate. You would regularly lose your classmates to measles, rubella, pertussis, and and that's just common illnesses, not epidemics. My grandfather lived through the 1918 flu, and I think about him often these days because his experience feels so much like ours now. Um, this is why it's so very important that if you can get vaccinated, get vaccinated. And if you can protect immunocompromised and vulnerable people in your culture, do what you can to protect them, guys. We're not entirely powerless, and we're not entirely alone either. This is a really human experience. And if the Romans were okay, we'll be okay too. So big hugs. Steady on. Let's talk about something else next slide, huh? Ah, fabulous! Adoptions! Oh, wait. Are we recording? Yes, we're recording. Adoptions. Lovely. So, you need some spare kids, and you're a Roman. How does this work? Well, for an official Roman adoption, this is how things go. We're going to talk about infant adoption, I think, really quickly here at the beginning. It's not that it didn't happen, but if you adopted a baby, it was assumed that that baby hadn't formed an attachment with their birth family. And it seems that when that happened, you would just enfold that person into your family and treat them as if they were biological offspring. There doesn't seem to be much of an adoption culture for children as a way to care for displaced and homeless children whose parents had died. A lot of that happened with informal social networks and also with human trafficking. Oh gosh, now this is going to be a happy slide. Right, on to the happy stuff. Okay, for Roman legal adoptions, the adoptive parent has to be over 30, and they have to prove that they're unable to produce legitimate children. Usually, having been married without any kids is enough. That'll do it. You don't have to undergo invasive testing. When you adopt somebody, it was assumed that you were adopting somebody from a family who was doing you a favor by giving you one of their spare kids. So, as a way of acknowledging that and saying thank you to the original family of your new child, you would take their original nomen and you would add honest to the end of it. So, I've given you an example here. This is an actual example. Gaius Julius Caesar, or Caius Julius Caesar, so this is our friend Caesar again. He adopted his nephew, his sister's kid, Gaius Octavius, yeah? So Octavius, when he's adopted by Caesar, takes his father's name just as if he'd been his biological son. So now he's Gaius Julius Caesar, but he gets this third cognomen to keep his birth family in there too. So he's Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And if you've ever wondered why we call Emperor Augustus Octavian sometimes, this is why. His name was Octavian when he was adopted by Julius Caesar, and then he gets this third cognomen, Augustus, as an honor from the Senate, and that's what we call him when he's emperor. More about that later. Just keep that under your hat for a while. This same model was used to name freedmen. I've nodded to this before. Here's the official time when we talk about this. Because your freedmen are treated as if they are your adopted sons and daughters, sort of. So say Gaius Julius Caesar frees Scintilla and Tiro. So these are slaves that Caesar would have given these people when he buys and enslaves them himself. Then when he frees them, they take the nomen, Julius or Julia, and if it's a male slave, they also take the praenomen. So Scintilla becomes Julia Scintilla or Julia Scintilla, and Tiro becomes Gaius Julius Tiro. And this is something we can look for on tombstones often. We'll find somebody with a very upper class looking first two names, and then the third name, the cognomen, will be a name that's a geographical origin, like sometimes you'll find Africanus or Africana for somebody who's from Africa, Aegyptus, Aegypta. Sometimes you'll get province names, Bithyniaca, Attique. Sometimes you'll get pet names. Scintilla means sparkly. It was a pretty common name for enslaved Roman women. And that's what we look for when we're reading a tombstone. We see a name like that, we start to suspect we're dealing with someone who either themselves or in their family's history has been enslaved.